You're listening to another episode of the Inspire Health Podcast. Thank you for joining us. This episode features another great mentor of mine, Dr. Stuart Shanker of the Merit Center. If you or your child is dealing with overwhelming stress and tension, this could be at the root of your struggles with behavior, mood, attention, and physical well-being. This is a rare opportunity to learn from one of the world experts in self-regulation. The key takeaway is that when an individual's stress levels are too high, various brain-body regulatory systems that support thinking, emotion, regulation, social engagement, and even metabolic recovery are compromised. Dr. Shanker's patented self-reg mindset, which focuses on the 5 key domains of self-regulation: biological, emotion, cognitive, social, and prosocial, has revolutionized the way that we view our children and youth. Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Inspire Health Podcast. With us today is a special guest. His name is Dr. Stuart Shanker. He is a distinguished research professor emeritus of philosophy and psychology at York University, and he's the CEO of the Merit Center. His book, Self-Reg, How to Help Your Child and You Break the Stress Cycle and Successfully Engage with Life, was written in 2016. It has garnered enthusiastic reviews and media attention throughout North America and has also been published in the US, the UK, South Korea, the Netherlands, Germany, as well as many other foreign editions. Dr. Shanker's 5-step self-reg model, known as the Shanker Method, is a powerful process for understanding and managing stress in children, youth, and adults. In 2012, Dr. Shanker founded the Merit Center as a self-reg learning and information center. Since then, the Merit Center has worked with educators, parents, and mental health professionals to bring the research and science of self-regulation to homes and classrooms across Canada and other countries. Dr. Shanker, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jason.
So this is exciting. I've been looking forward to chatting with you for a while and picking your brain on some of these topics. But
pick away.
For those that aren't, in general, I think I've heard self-regulation has come up a lot more, I think, over the last 5 years or so, at least in my world. I hear it come up a lot more and from different fields, all kind of talking about it from different perspectives. Can you explain a little bit, just break it down for people, what exactly self-regulation is from your perspective and how you came about it, that it was, you recognize it as being such an important piece of things, you decided to dedicate most of your professional life to this area?
So that one question alone is going to use up our entire podcast. It's a very good question. So let's start at the beginning. I went to Oxford, and at Oxford I studied self-regulation as it was originally understood. So this is an idea that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. And it was really, the simplest way of explaining it was about how we manage stress. And I looked at that issue from a number of different angles. We looked at it as philosophers, we looked at it as psychologists, but also physiologists. And at the end of my time in the UK, I was looking at it in terms of artificial intelligence. Now, when I got back here, I discovered that there was a very different understanding of self-regulation. And they thought of self-regulation as really some kind of self-control. And in fact, we did a big study on this, and we found there are 447 different definitions of self-regulation. I should add that we did that study about 5 years ago, so we're probably up to over 500 now.
That would take the whole interview.
But there, we did so Jason, we did a cluster analysis. So basically we broke it down into the most common uses, and the way it's standardly used is about self-monitoring or self-control. And this was kind of surprising for me, because that's not at all the way I had been taught. It wasn't at all what we were looking at. What we were looking at is how a person deals with stress, and we have to explain what that means in 1 second. And there are good ways and bad ways. And that's a really important point for what you and I are going to talk about today. We distinguish between maladaptive and adaptive or mindful ways of self-regulating. So let me give you an example of what this means. The original definition of stress is anything that requires us to burn energy. That's what a stress, as this was defined by an American physiologist at the beginning of the 20th century. And his example that he gave was cold temperatures. So cold weather, so what cold weather does is it triggers a system deep inside the brain, in the limbic system, to engage in a number of physiological reactions that generate heat. And the idea here is very simple. The body has to stay around 37 degrees. So if our body temperature drops below a set point, then what happens is we'll start to shiver. Our teeth will chatter. Chattering is actually a form of shivering. And what this does is it generates heat, body heat, as a byproduct. So we have all these things that are going on inside the body to keep our internal temperature as close as we can to 37. But now there's things that we can do that reduce the amount of energy we burn trying to stay at 37. So, for example, we can wear a warm coat. We can wear a hat. We can build special kinds of shelters. If you live in the very far north of Canada, you'll have a special diet which is very rich in slow release forms of energy. That's what muktak is. It's slow release energy. So what we're doing is we are self-regulating in order to reduce the amount of work that our body has to do. We are managing the stress of the cold by things that we've learned from our parents and our culture. So that's a very adaptive, a beneficial way of self-regulating, of managing a stress. But we can do it other ways. We can do it stupid ways. So I'll give you the classic example of stupid ways. One time I was, my PhD was on an Austrian, so we spent a lot of time in Austria. And I was with all my Austrian friends, and we were skiing. We were at the top of the mountain, and I was bloody cold. So they said to me, well, what you do when you're cold is you drink yogurte. I'm not a drinker. Do you know what yogurte is? It's incredibly strong, but I don't drink at all. So I had a glass of the yogurte, and boy, did I ever get warm fast. It's a very quick way. But then the next thing I knew, I was skiing down the mountain on one ski, finding all this hilarious. And then I managed to get down to the bottom. And then when we got back to the lodge, I shivered for about 3 or 4 hours, because what alcohol does is it provides that momentary feeling, that momentary body of heat, because it's a sugar and it releases energy. Consequences within 15-20 minutes are you're even colder. That's what we call a maladaptive mode of self-regulation. A maladaptive mode of self-regulating is doing something which may reduce your stress in the moment, but creates more stress down the road. So we were running a clinic at York, and what we found with every one of the kids that we were working with, these were children that were having a lot of stress problems, stress-related problems, being overstressed, what we found was they all had maladaptive modes of self-regulating. So our job was to try to shift them from maladaptive to adaptive, to mindful. So can I give you one last example, and then I'll
for
come up
sure.
with breath? So in our clinic, we worked primarily with children on the spectrum. And one of the common features of not universal, but common, of a child with autism is that they find social interaction very stressful. It's a big stress, just like the cold weather. And they manage that stress by, say, gaze aversion. So they turn their eyes away and they won't look at you in your eyes because it's very, very stressful for them. It's painful. But now you have a problem. And the problem is we need shared gaze as a child to learn language, to learn the meaning of facial expressions. So this is a classic example of maladaptive self-regulation. What they were doing was they were reducing the stress of the moment, but creating tons more stress down the road when they needed language, when they needed to social interaction or mind reading. So that's the first part of answering you. It's understanding that we all do self-regulate. We self-regulate in ways that may be maladaptive, and we are looking now at a culture where children and teens are really self-regulating in very maladaptive ways, like spending too much time on a smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what this is all about, and that's why your question was important. Getting clear on what we mean, what scientists mean when they talk about self-regulation.
Yeah, I love the way that you broke that down, and it makes me think that almost at epidemic proportions,
Agreed.
Everybody is doing maladaptive forms of stress management.
I think that's exactly it.
Including the parents and managing their kids, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment too. But
I think that's great. That's exactly the point.
Yeah, and I mean, I see it in just different ways. So, like, for example, say someone's feeling stressed and it changes what their cravings are to eat, which maybe makes you feel momentarily okay, but sets you on a cascade of events that is going to ultimately perpetuate the hole that you're going into.
So I hope that maybe down the road you'll do a podcast on what you just said, because that's huge, right? So we're seeing an explosion, an epidemic of obesity. And so eating high energy foods is a classic example of a maladaptive mode because it creates these problems down the road. So what we really want to figure out, and the reason why we do self-reg, is why am I so stressed, and what are the ways I can manage this stress in a healthy way?
Yeah. Well, when you're talking about stress, let's break down stress a little bit, because I feel like that's really misunderstood.
I agree.
And a lot of people think, particularly with kids, it's like, well, what do kids have to be stressed about? Maybe a little bit with school or maybe bullying, but it's like, what a lot of people don't understand is like stress is a very big picture and there's so many layers to it. So maybe from your perspective, break down what you look at from stress and what are some of the things that parents might be able to identify with when we talk about stress and what those might be first.
One of the things we find over and over, we used to do this exercise when I was doing large group talks where I'd have them write down their examples of what stresses are. And over you'd get psychosocial stresses. So, money, not having enough time in the day, whatever. And those are stresses, right? Mm-hmm. Those are emotional stresses. But in fact, if you go back to what I said at the outset, Walter Cannon's definition is a stress is anything that requires us to burn energy in order to maintain our furnace, as it were, in its working range. So what we started to do was we broke stress down. We got as many examples as we could. And we had hundreds of examples of stresses, and we broke them down, and we found is they can pretty much all go into 5 basic categories. So one category is easy. That's what you just mentioned, emotional stress. So the stresses of modern life, I had my daughter about an hour ago explain to me who, I've forgotten the name already. It's one of the Kardashians. I didn't know who they were either. But it creates a lot of stress for kids, right? But then we have emotional stress and we have social stress. And I think that your listeners will be pretty good at figuring out what those are in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have physical stress, cognitive stress, and what we call prosocial stress. So I'll spend 2 seconds on physical and cognitive, because those are big for your listeners. Prosocial stress, that's for another time. That's the stress of dealing with someone else's distress. And so that's pretty expensive for us. Physical stress are things like, now, what everyone needs to understand is no two children are the same. And not only that, not only is every kid different, but the little buggers are changing on you all the time. So what was a stress last week isn't this week, and what they were easily dealing with suddenly becomes a stress. So you're constantly learning how to read the signs of what my kid finds stressful. So the easy examples is you'll start off with noise. Is noise a stress? Is lighting a stress? Too much lighting or not enough, is that a stress? Smells. Smells are a big stress for kids that are often ignored. And I get asked this all the time. What's a cognitive stress? And there's a real simple answer. Math. Math is a cognitive stress.
That was a big cognitive stress for me.
Well, what we're finding now is of 40% of all children 7 to 9. So it's interesting what you just said. It was a big cognitive stress for you, but yet here you are, a clinical psych. So I know exactly what that means, and I know exactly how much math you had to conquer, all the stats you had to do in order to become a psychologist, a clinical psychologist. So somehow you learned how to deal with that stress and turn it into, I suspect, something that you actually enjoy. But we're seeing kids with what's called high math anxiety. And when that happens, they actually go into fight or flight. They actually see math as a threat. How do we know this? Well, we know it because some really cool scientists out at Western did brain scans on them and found that they were going into fight or flight just at the thought of doing math. So this is a big topic. Why is this a cognitive stress for kids? And we can explain it now. And what do we do so it stops being a cognitive stress? How did we cause this to become a cognitive stress in the first place? These are, but basically what it means is that the cognitive challenge makes the kid anxious. And what anxiety does is it lowers your threshold for a stress response in all 5 domains. So now, all of a sudden, if I'm finding math a stress, I'm also finding the noise from the kids around me a stress. I'm finding the chair I'm sitting on a stress. I'm finding sitting still a stress. So they get caught in a stress cycle. The biggest finding that we've made is that it starts with mom and dad themselves. It starts with our stress. Because one of the things that happens when we are overstressed, we as adults are overstressed, is we can't see when our child is overstressed. We do, whether it's with parents, whether it's with teachers, whether it's with clinicians. We start with your own self-regulation. How are you managing stress? Do you know when you are overstressed? Do you know when you are becoming overstressed? Do you know why?
Yeah, that's I think that's such a big take-home one for parents too. Just in my clinic, sometimes what I'll even find is one of the areas of my clinic that we look at is we do some specific biochemical testing that can be related to how people think, feel, and act.
Interesting.
And what I'll find is I've had sometimes where I've had parents bring in their children for ADHD or anxiety, and their testing shows up okay, and then I actually run the parents, and the parents' testing is the one that's out of balance.
Okay, so that's absolutely fascinating.
Or both of them are.
What are you looking at? Are you looking at cortisol?
You'll be interested. You'll love one of the podcasts I did earlier. So I'm a naturopathic doctor and an osteopath, and so one of the trainings that I did was with Dr. William Walsh, who's one of the world experts in sort of nutritional biochemistry and looking at the relationships between that and most mental health conditions. So I'll see a lot of people coming in. He's got a huge research database in autism and ADHD and whatnot. And so there's certain imbalances that can happen in the biochemistry that can basically perpetuate the cycles where you might have higher levels of adrenaline naturally that are just sort of pushing that cycle. You can have conversions in some of the enzymes that move dopamine into norepinephrine. There could be ones that cause you to basically drain out your levels of serotonin and dopamine at times. And so if those things are going on, then in my mind, it's like that's one of the biochemical physical stresses that child's, when you were talking about like their threshold.
Fabulous.
It's like they just don't even know what their normal range could actually be. And a lot of this is epigenetic that's passed down from the family tree. But what's really interesting is
that's great.
You'll see the whole families, and then you'll see patterns in the parents that have also now see patterns in the children, or there's sometimes where I only see the pattern in the parents. And so then they are picking up directly from you. And when I came across your work and you talked a little bit about the interbrain connection, that was really fascinating.
That's the point. That's the point.
Because when I saw that, I'm like, oh my gosh. And then I'll explain that to parents so that they helps them just sort of step into the role that they need to be in to ultimately support their child. Because a lot of people don't realize how much of an impact we as children pick up from our parents for our lifetime.
Let's take the example you gave. Either there's too much norepinephrine or too much epinephrine. So what will you then do?
So I'll give you an example. One of the primary tests that we would look for would be looking at, say, a zinc and copper balance. So when you look at the enzymes, when you are converting, say, when you're converting dopamine into norepinephrine, which is a natural physiological pathway, that always happens. But one of the primary cofactors that catalyzes the hydroxylase enzyme in that is copper. And what we'll often see with children with ADHD, for example, is they classically have quite substantially higher copper levels. And what it does is it sort of drives that reaction where now they're over-converting dopamine. So they classically get that low dopamine, high norepinephrine, which is the low ability to focus.
This is very interesting.
And the hyperactivity that goes with it.
How are you doing the tests? What do you use?
They're run through Gamma Dynacare or Life Labs.
But I mean, is it blood or is it saliva?
No, those ones are specifically, we would do a serum copper, a plasma zinc, and a ceruloplasmin. And when we see that, we can then make calculations based on that to figure out what their percent free copper is and what the zinc copper ratio is. I'll give you one other example with it. When we check for something called urine pyrroles. So pyrroles is sort of a building block to making red blood cells. Everybody makes them, but some people have an epigenetic imbalance where they either make too much of them or they can't keep them long enough, they keep them too long and they can't get rid of them as easily. And when pyrroles, first they donate iron to make hemoglobin, and once they've donated iron, they have a really strong affinity for aldehydes, particularly B6, and they also bind zinc. So what happens is you end up with a severe deficiency in B6 and zinc. Why those are so important is because when you look at the last step from, say, making serotonin, dopamine, and GABA, so when you go from like 5-HTP to serotonin, it's a decarboxylase enzyme, and it's a similar enzyme in both conversion for serotonin, dopamine, and GABA, and it's dependent on B6 and zinc. So if you don't have enough of those cofactors, you get a rate limiting step. So you end up with a production issue. You can't make enough of the neurochemistry that really sets you up to be able to regulate your behavior.
So your treatment is going to be, you're going to be working behavioral and you're going to be working nutritionally.
Well, this is what I found really fascinating, and why I think there's this is why I wanted to do this series, because there's so many pieces to it. So what I've found is that when people have some, and say for example, I'll give you an example. I had a patient who was diagnosed with anxiety disorder and ADHD. Pyro levels should normally be between about 0 and 10. It's a simple urine test that's done. His levels were about 100. Now, he was having complete meltdowns. He was under the table biting himself when he'd have a meltdown, like anything to try to just, finding his own way to try to regulate what he was feeling inside. Yeah. But I can honestly say that child's probably never known what it feels like to be able to regulate naturally because of that imbalance. And when that imbalance comes back down, you often find that they're able to start to regulate their behavior better. But what I found is that if they've had it for a longer time, they've then developed the neural networks that become patterns. So then they're still being triggered by stuff, but the intensity is down enough that they can work with it more effectively, but there's still often now patterns that need to be resolved.
So, what you're just all the work we do, what we find, so we use the language of dynamic systems theory, and we talk about a tractor being formed. And basically what happens is when you get locked into a maladaptive, we'll go back to my language. So you get locked into a maladaptive mode of self-regulating. So now what's happened is you have, there's a complex neural net that has to be shifted.
Yeah.
The only way we can shift it is by lowering the overall stress load. So what we do is we start with the stresses that we can reduce, which are generally very easy. Now, I should just tell you that at the Big Mary study, we did in fact use both osteopathy and a naturopath over and over again. So we found exactly what you're describing. So that sort of multi-pronged way of shifting a pattern that is deeply entrenched at the level of how the brain processes stimuli. But it is doable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I find that all really fascinating. And ultimately, I just want to know all the different pieces and how they really play together. And the thing I find is, like, for a lot of the children, it's hard to know what percentage is just this physical, what percentage is biochemical, what percentage of this. So you kind of have to look at all of it and ultimately just pull the different pieces together for them.
So the one thing that we found repeatedly is that any treatment that we've done has to be through the interbrain. So what that means is that there is this brain-to-brain hookup. And this is a reality of throughout the lifespan. If we don't have these positive interbrain hookups, whether we're a child 0 to 3 or a teenager or someone or an elderly, that our first step is always to reestablish interbrain. And I'll tell you something really, really interesting. We had a lot of kids that came to us diagnosed as having insecure attachment. So that's very interesting, right? And I don't know, can we just use that term, or does that need to be explained?
That's fine. Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So, so we looked at the kids interacting with their parents, and we'd spent a long time on this, and we thought, oh my goodness, this is a wonderful attachment. And what we realized is there's a fundamental distinction between secure attachment and fragile attachment. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, in a case of fragile attachment, it means that the child has all kinds of sensitivities. Maybe they find, let's say, noise more stressful. or they find certain foods, flavors more stressful. But mom or dad or whoever have been really good. They've been what we call sensitive caregivers. They've been really good at figuring out what their child's sensitivities are and adjusting how they deal with the child accordingly. Then the child goes off to preschool or school and everything falls apart. Mm-hmm. So what happened? And now all of a sudden you've got a child who is presenting as insecurely attached, and we have all those behavioral measures of that, right? Even though we can see that this is a wonderfully warm, interactive relationship with mom and dad. And so we lost sight of the fact that the child goes through a series of interbrain relationships, beginning with that kindergarten teacher or the daycare provider. And where these kids got into trouble is when, and so now I want to introduce a fundamental distinction. When they left the home where they felt safe and secure, and they're in an environment with an adult that confuses misbehavior with stress behavior. They think that the child is acting up because he's misbehaving. Okay, so let's take as an example the kid who, starts to shout or kick, whatever. These are stress behaviors. Mm-hmm. But the adult doesn't understand what you and I are doing. And so what happens is they respond, they get angry, they punish, they rationalize their behavior with the kid as he has to learn how to take responsibility for his actions. He has to learn that if he doesn't control these outbursts or these impulses, he'll have no one else to blame. So they are, in fact, worsening a situation of fragile secure attachment because they don't understand the difference between misbehavior and stress behavior. They don't know what the signs are of what a child is when a child's overstressed, and they don't recognize that they themselves are dramatically adding to that child's overall stress load. I can't tell you how many times we've had to deal with this.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part, and that's really in a nutshell, I think, where parents run into their troubles. And
I agree.
It's a mix of that. Also, what I think is really important is that what they need to understand too is that when your child is in a stressed behavior, they're not acting completely from their conscious mind. They're not making conscious choices to do that per se. They are in a very reactive state.
Okay, so a huge part of our work is we use a model, which is called the Triune Brain model. Mm-hmm. And the Triune Brain was invented by an American neuroscientist, and called Paul MacLean. He published a book on this. And again, parents can download a picture of the Triune Brain from our website for free. So what MacLean's argument was that we have three brains in one. We have a very old brain, an ancient brain, what he called the reptilian brain. This is a brain that evolved for reptiles hundreds and hundreds of millions of years ago. And reptiles are solitary creatures. They are what are called singletons. And so, the mom lays her eggs and then she disappears. And the baby hatches 245 days later and makes its way on its own down to the water, whatever, mm-hmm. and feeds itself. When it is threatened, it has a very limited repertoire of defensive behaviors. So you mentioned the two of the neurohormones that we study very carefully, norepinephrine and epinephrine. And so what happens is with epinephrine, the reptile has a fight response, and with norepinephrine, a withdrawal response, fight or flight.
Oh, interesting.
Yep. If that fails, they go into freeze, which is essentially another neurohormone. It's parasympathetic flooding. And if that fails, they go into quasi-death experience. It's called tonic immobility. Now, MacLean's hypothesis was that around 200 million years ago, social creatures evolved. Reptiles are non-social. They're solitary. Social creatures are mammals. So with mammals, you get mothers raising their babies, licking and all that stuff, all the epigenetic stuff you were talking about. You also get a system for monitoring other mammals of your group, which is called neuroception. Neuroception. This is important for all the work you do. If you remind me, I'll come back to it later. So the idea behind neuroception is that the mammal is constantly scanning its environment. Is this stranger a threat or safety? So you're constantly making these neuroceptive perceptions, and if it registers danger, so the way it's moving, facial expression, whatever, sounds it's making, then we have an alarm in this primitive mammal brain called the amygdala, which sends a signal down to the reptile brain that's still in us and says, I need fight or flight, I need it now. Give me a shot of epinephrine right now. But what's happening here is when it goes into that reptile brain, it has regressed to a pre-social, non-cognitive state. Okay, last one. On top of that mammal brain, so McLean's argument is about 3 million years ago, we got a prefrontal cortex. And this is wonderful for us. It thinks, it has language, it plans, it's self-aware, all these really cool things that human beings can do. So there is this tension between that top brain, that prefrontal cortex, and the middle brain, the limbic brain. Now I want to get to what you said. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that we do things for reasons. We choose. We are conscious. We're conscious of the choices we're making. That brain underneath, the limbic brain, what we call a red brain in self-reg, the red brain does not choose. It's a mammalian brain. It's caused. It has primitive mechanisms that cause its reactions. So you can't, so tell me if this is clear, Jason. Mm-hmm. You cannot use the terms that apply to that top brain, the prefrontal brain, to that middle brain. The middle brain doesn't choose anything. Mm-hmm. The middle brain doesn't form judgments. It's just a primitive brain. Now here's the problem. When a kid has stress behaviors, those are behaviors coming from the middle brain. Yeah. The child's not choosing. You cannot hold the child responsible because he didn't make a bad choice. He didn't choose at all. His actions were caused by ancient systems. So what's the basic cause here? So we call these limbic behaviors. What's causing them? Stress. Too much stress. So the kid needs some stress. We know we thrive on stress, but if the stress is too great, we need stress to wake up. We need challenges in life. But if the child is overstressed, you get limbic behaviors. And then what was happening to these children was they were in a situation like in early years where they were being treated as if they were making bad choices, but they weren't choosing. These are caused, and they were caused by too much stress. So to help mom and dad, what we had to do was go into the school and we had to teach the teachers about self-reg, starting with their own self-reg. That's a long explanation, but that's basically what's going on here.
Yeah, no, that was beautiful. And I find when it gets explained to parents like that, there's a softening that happens with the
Agreed.
Because
Agreed.
They sort of like, oh my gosh. And,
I love it.
And I mean, in some ways, I can't remember if this was in one of your books that I'd read it in, but even when we talk about the cerebral cortex, it's like, even from, I'll explain it sometimes to the parent, I'm like, you got to remember too, like, even as a child, it's like this, that part of the brain that dials in and
Yeah.
integrates and myelinates to the prefrontal
Yeah.
cortex doesn't even get finished until you're in your early 20s. So
Yeah.
it's like, I kind of say it, if you got to think of it this way, if you're having a hard time trying to self-regulate, you got to remember that it's probably 100 times harder for your child to do it, because they're not, we've got access to it properly. They don't even have access to it completely. So
there's an American psychologist called Lawrence Sternberg, and he's got this wonderful line. And he says, if you're working with parents that have a teenager, tell them this: your teenager's got a brain where it's like he's driving a Ferrari and there's no driver at the wheel.
Yeah, I think I heard it one time where it said it's getting wired, but it's not myelinated. So they think everything's connected, but it's still not totally usable in the way.
And you're right; it's around mid-20s when it finally. Yeah, and it's around the mid-20s when it's finally finished myelinating and the connections are forged. So, but on top of all that, I would come back to what you said at the very beginning. You made what I think is like the number one remark, and that is that we are seeing a generation of children now, going back to really young ones, that are not just overstressed, but hugely overstressed. And parents come and say, well, how can that be? How can my child be overstressed? Why do you say that? Well, first of all, look at the behaviors. These are stress behaviors. You can read it you can hear it in your child's voice. Your child's voice will go up in pitch, just like other mammals. The pitch goes up, the frequency changes, the rhythm changes. You can hear, and parents will then sort of say, oh yeah, you know what? I can always tell when she's overstressed, and I'm not even in the same room just from her voice. So then they want to know, well, why? And it's a complicated why, right? So there's tons of stresses that these kids are subjected to across all 5 of domains, plus a decline in those mindful ways of self-regulating, the things that the children used to do, like being together or playing outside or whatever. So it's a combination of lots, but even something as seemingly benign as that breakfast cereal that you're giving them could in fact be a physiological stressor.
Yeah. One thing I'd love to get your feedback on, just because when you had mentioned self-control and self-regulation, very different, because one thing I will find, and this goes hand in hand with the fact that I think most times just parents are overwhelmed and they're just trying, they can't handle it themselves. So
Agreed.
There's a multifactorial piece around this and working with parents and kids. But one thing that I've seen, I'm sure you've come across a lot too, is screens become a very potent babysitter. And in the perspective sometimes from the parents is, oh, it's amazing. It calms them down. They're quiet. They seem to be in better behavior when they're sitting there and when they're with their screen. But this reminds me a lot of when you were talking about self-control versus self-regulation. It's like what they see maybe in that moment, that's like eating your donut when you're feeling bad. But
you got it.
So maybe you can just mention a little bit around your perspective from screens and even what you found, when that should even be brought in from your perspective, how much is too much. I know it's all individual, but just some perspective around this, because the other day,
I love what you're saying.
They had brought in, for my stepson, they had brought in Chromebooks across the board for the school. And my wife and I phoned in because I wasn't really comfortable with that idea that all of the education was going to be done on these computer Chromebooks now. And so they were kind of astounded because my wife and I were the only ones that phoned in questioning whether that was really a good idea or not. And so I thought, really? We need to move out where you are, I think. But
how old are we talking about?
He's 14. But what I would find was that he'd come back and there'd be video games on it. He'd have the YouTube videos downloaded on it. So it's not an easy thing for even the teachers to totally control. But outside of that, it's just more around the idea of from a perspective of screens, computers, games, video games, I mean, gosh, Fortnite is this crazy addictive game that's going on now.
Yeah.
What's going on, just so parents get an idea of how that can affect them from a down the road kind of a perspective, even if they seem to be quiet and behaving while they're doing it.
So again, you realize that you're asking, I mean, this is a big topic, right? So the very first question we always ask parents when we have this conversation is, so how was he when you turned it off? Turned it off himself, did he? And he was all, did you have, no, okay, so you're laughing and we know the answer. So what's going on here? Let me take it 2 steps. The second step will be, you know, how do we work our way around this as parents? We now know there's a very interesting book out there by a guy called Nir Eyal, E-Y-A-L, called The Hook Model. And so what these guys have done is they went back and studied psychology from the 60s and 70s, where behaviorists were trying to figure out how they could program or train habits in rats and mice. And what they learned, and so these were very meticulous scientists, these are the behaviorists, and what they learned was how to trigger dopamine. So we call it dopamine hijacking. And it turns out it's not actually very hard to trigger dopamine. It's not hard to train a habit. So these guys went back and read all this stuff and they thought, geez, if you can do that to a rat, so you can get a rat to press this lever, or you can get a rat to basically do behaviors that are very self-harmful, very self-destructive, maybe I could use these ideas and design a game. So how can I design well, I'll just use the game as an example. How can I design a game where what keeps the kid going is trying to get a shot of dopamine? And it turns out that the old tricks that the behaviorists discovered are equally good here. So you do something like what's called a variable reward schedule. So that means sometimes you're going to get 20 points and sometimes you're going to get 200 points and sometimes you won't get any. And that's very addictive in itself. We use colors, we use sounds, all these things. Now there's a problem, and the problem is that you get used to dopamine. So I got to keep on figuring out how can I keep the dopamine pumping. So what they do is they will, I don't know about Fortnite, but I sort of think I know. So that's going to be a classic example. The example we give is Candy Crush. So Candy Crush is just, it's a brilliant exploitation of dopamine hijacking. There's another book I'll mention by a guy called Chris Nodder. The book is called Evil by Design. And it's not meant facetiously. He's literally trying to tell programmers how you can use these tricks to hook a kid's brain. And they don't think there's anything wrong with that. So here's the problem. So now the kid plays Candy Crush because each new level, what it does is it gets the dopamine going again. And it turns out that the child is playing only to get dopamine. Not the whatever the goals of the game are stupid. They don't mean anything. Okay. So when we try to analyze, like, what's the problem here? So we drew this distinction today between misbehavior and stress behavior. And now I want to draw another one. And there's a fundamental distinction between calmness and dissociation. So what happens is, you mentioned now, when the kid goes into this kind of limbic state, what's happening is it has this, dopamine has, it gives you a nice little buzz, little bit of energy, but also you're having this sedating effect. So if the kid is feeling a little bit anxious, I can't remember all the ways you said it, but the kid's a little bit anxious, a little bit stressed because of other kids, whatever is going on, and so they find that if they play the game, that they don't notice the tension, they don't notice the anxiety. Now there's the key between calmness and dissociation. In calmness, you don't have the tension. You don't have the intrusive thoughts. In dissociation, you just don't notice them.
Mm-hmm.
Our problem now is when the child begins to self-regulate with the game. So basically what we're saying here is they're feeling very stressed, so they play Candy Crush for 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever, in order to manage their stress. But it is maladaptive. It's maladaptive because when they get off the game, they're even more tense. They haven't done anything to rebalance. They haven't done anything to replenish their energy. And in fact, they've gone deeper into a high energy, a high tension, low energy state. That's a classic example where you and I started today of maladaptive self-regulation. Okay, so how do we help parents now? So what we help parents is we want to look at understanding, first of all, this distinction. There's one thing to talk about a child being quiet. It's another thing to talk about a child being actually restoring. They are not restoring from these games. A little's not going to hurt anybody. But what they have to ask themselves is, has this become a maladaptive mode of self-regulation, not just for the child, but for me? Is this my own maladaptive mode of self-regulation? So, yeah, there's going to have to be a big change around this one. This is a serious problem. This isn't a minor problem. It's a big problem.
And when you were talking about dopamine and whatnot, it almost reminds me a little bit about how I think about diabetics a little bit.
Yeah, good.
A lot of times what happens is, they're used to such a high level of insulin that eventually the receptors don't register it the same way anymore. So you kind of get insulin resistance. Yeah. And you almost get this same dopamine.
Agreed. And Jason, we've used that example ourselves. And one of the interesting things about someone who's in a pre-diabetic condition is that, so they've gone to sleep, okay? And they're sleeping, and you say, well, they're restoring. But if they're pre-diabetic, it turns out that, in fact, that physiologically, they are burning an enormous amount of energy because the pancreas has to create all this extra insulin. And a group of Swedish scientists found exactly the same result with kids who played violent video games and then went to sleep. Exactly the same. It's not just an analogy, it's the same reaction.
That's neat. Yeah, I hadn't heard that study, but that's exactly what it makes me think about when
yeah, us too.
Okay, so we'll finish it up here just one sec. I just want to ask you one last question. From your perspective, for the first things that parents, top couple things that parents could start to do or be aware of that you think would give them steps right off the bat to learn a little bit more about this, to how they can start to the process of assisting their child with self-regulating. A couple of key ones, and maybe where they can be directed to find some more of that information.
Okay, so let's give them 5 steps that they can go through. Number 1, ask themselves, is this misbehavior, is it stress behavior? When they ask that question, they will have what you described about 20 minutes ago, that feeling of, just seeing that it's stress behavior is an enormous relief. Number 2, identify the stresses. Go through all 5 domains. I'm beginning to see that my kid is overstressed. I have no idea why. I'm going to start with physical. I'm going to look at everything going on and try to figure it out. There are some very useful stress inventories. They can download one, I believe, off our website, again, for free. Number 3, reduce the stress. So how do I reduce the stress? Well, if I know that, let's say my child is sensitive to odors, then get non-odor soap, get non-odor floor polish. If she's sensitive to noise, then you can experiment with noise-canceling headphones in the classroom. There's all kinds of ways to reduce. Number 4, the child has to become aware of when he or she is becoming overstressed. When they're young, they have all kinds of physical signs. So you have to help them identify those physical signs mean you need to take a break. You need to, whatever it is that's going to work, and that's step 5. What's going to work for your child to get them back in balance? Every kid is different. So I've got 2 kids. For my son, when he was a little guy, it meant shooting pucks at the garage door. Not so good for mom, really good for him. For my daughter, it was building Lego stuff. So, but whatever it is, for cooking, walking, whatever, something. But, and here's the big but, none of this works until you've done it on yourself. So now you got to go back and you got to look at those 5 steps and you've got to ask yourselves, go through one by one, how does it apply to me? Because our children are overstressed, but you said this right at the top. We are all overstressed. Okay, now where can they get all this? So our website is www.self-reg.ca, self-reg.ca, and we run all kinds of online courses for educators and parents, and then my last book, which I wrote for parents, which is just called Self-Reg. And that's it.
The last book that you had, what was the name of your recent book?
The last one is Self-Reg. The one before that is Calm, Alert, and Learning. And then the new book, which will be out in probably about a year, it's going to be called Potentiating Human Potential.
Wonderful. Dr. Shanker, thank you so much for your time. I would love to pick your brain again at another time, but...
okay, well, keep it up in the meantime and send us your podcast.
We will for sure. Thanks so much, Dr. Shanker.
You're welcome, Jason.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.